The nation of Scotland is known to be home to many iconic battles throughout history, such as Falkirk, Stirling Bridge, and Bannockburn. In this video, we will cover the events leading up to the First Jacobite Rising, such as the Battle of Sedgemoor during Monmouth's rebellion, and the battles of Loop Hill, Killiecrankie, Dunkeld, and Cromdale. In the year 1685, James, Duke of York, succeeded his brother Charles II to the throne of England, Scotland, and Ireland, taking the titles of King James II of England and 7th of Scotland. James had been next in line for the throne since Charles failed to produce a legitimate son as his heir. It was due to James's Catholicism that many in England were wary of James taking the throne, even though Charles had kept to the rules of natural succession. In that same year, one of Charles's illegitimate sons, James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, who is currently in exile in the Netherlands due to his attempted assassination of his father in the Rye House plot, had decided that now was the time to strike. As a staunch Protestant, Monmouth had assumed that the people of England would flock to him as he marched through the West Country, while one of his supporters, the Duke of Argyll, went to rally support from Clan Campbell in Scotland. As he moved through western England, Monmouth's numbers swelled up to 6,000 men, consisting mostly of nonconformists, artisans, and farmers armed with farming tools such as pitchforks. As the Royalist army began to close in on the rebels, their commander Lord Feversham aimed to contain the rebels in the southwest until further reinforcements of infantry and artillery arrived. By this time, word had reached Monmouth that the Scottish rebellion had failed, and his support was starting to dwindle. Monmouth had fortified himself in the town of Bridgewater, but realized that he needed a victory in order to renew momentum in his cause. He attempted a night assault against the Royalists encamped at Sedgemoor. The Royalist army was immediately alerted, however, and the resulting battle was nothing short of a massacre, as Monmouth's disorganized host was cut to pieces by disciplined musket and cannon fire, and then by the King's regiment of horse in the pursuit. Hundreds were killed in the initial battle, and many more in the trials conducted after by the notorious Judge Jeffreys in what became known as the Bloody Assizes. After his capture, Monmouth personally pleaded for mercy from James himself. James would give no quarter, and Monmouth was beheaded at the Tower of London on July 15, 1685. After this rebellion, James had felt more secure on his throne, and saw fit to further consolidate his power. He demanded Parliament repeal the Habeas Corpus Act, which gave prisoners or third parties acting on their behalf the right to challenge their detention by demanding from the Lord Chancellor, Justices of the King's Bench, and Barons of the Exchequer of the jurisdiction a judicial review of their imprisonment, as well as repeal the Test Act, which did not allow Catholics to take up higher positions of employment. James had made more demands to Parliament, most of which were refused by them. James subsequently dissolved Parliament. The final straw came after the controversial birth of James's son, James Francis Edward Stuart, on June 10, 1688. With the Catholic succession now imminent, many English nobles reached out to Stadtholder of the Netherlands William of Orange to make a landing and depose James. William would do just that, and landed with a sizable force on November 5th and sent James fleeing into exile in France in what would be known as the Bloodless Glorious Revolution. Despite his desire to use English resources in his defense against French incursions into the Netherlands, William would soon face resistance within his newly acquired kingdoms. James was not going to take his deposition lying down, and landed in Ireland on March 12, 1689 with a number of French officers and troops. Due to Ireland being a majority Catholic nation, James was able to consolidate control of the island relatively quickly, with cities in the Protestant Ulster region such as Londonderry and Enniskillen still holding out. The events detailing the Jacobite War in Ireland deserve their own videos, which we will cover another time, but almost simultaneously, Scottish General John Graham, 1st Viscount Dundee, raised his royal standard at Dundee Law in support of James II. Dundee was a veteran soldier that served in the Dutch Scots Brigade during the Franco-Dutch War, and was later given command of a Highland company to police southwest Scotland, mainly against the Covenanter militants that rose up in rebellion in 1679. By April, most of Ireland was held by the Jacobites. In Ulster, only Londonderry was still held by a Protestant garrison. The western peninsula of Kintyre was strategically important since it allowed Dundee to be resupplied from Ireland using small boats, which was essential as all major Scottish ports were held by the Williamite government. In choosing sides, local rivalries were as important as allegiance to the Stuarts or religion. Kintyre was previously dominated by the MacDonalds and McAllisters, before becoming subordinate to the expansionist Campbells in the 1670s. After Argyll's rising, the original owners regained their independence, but with the advent of the new government and return of Argyll to favour, they faced losing it once again. Government-backed Campbell militia took possession of Tarbert Castle in April, shortly before a French merchant ship commandeered by Irish refugees arrived in Skipness, raising fears of an Irish invasion. The dangers of losing control of Kintyre were obvious to the government, but they were short of troops. Commissions for raising new regiments were only issued in April, and many were still forming. A unit of around 500 men under Captain William Young was put together from those available and transferred in small boats to Tarbert, where they landed on May 15th. Confident of Irish support, several of the McAllisters declared for James and occupied Skipness Castle on the eastern side of the peninsula. Since this blocked Young moving south, he advanced across the peninsula to occupy their estates of Loop House and Largy. As he did so, he ran into a force of 200 men under McNeill and Gordie McAllister, positioned on the slopes of Loop Hill. Young reported they fired at each other before the Jacobites fled. His force suffered no casualties and they found only 2 enemy dead. Unwilling to trust his inexperienced troops to win a night attack, he decided not to pursue, and continued on his way to Clachan, where he was joined by local Williamite supporters. Realizing they were outnumbered, the Jacobite chiefs abandoned Kintyre to the government and escaped to Ireland. William's military commander in Scotland was General Hugh Mackay of Scuddy, who was another veteran of the Franco-Dutch War while in service of the Dutch Scots Brigade. Mackay marched to Glenroy with 3,500 troops. Jacobite commander Ewan Cameron of Lochiel had begun recruiting men prior to Mackay's arrival, and Dundee joined him and his force of 1,800 Highlanders and attempted to bring Mackay into accepting battle. This failed and most of Dundee's men deserted him, bringing his number to only 200 men. Dundee had written to the Earl of Melfort asking for reinforcements, but the loss of Kintyre after the Battle of Loop Hill made receiving reinforcements and resupply from Ireland exceedingly difficult. On June 14th, Edinburgh Castle had surrendered, and it seemed all hope was lost for the Scottish Jacobites. However, a detachment of 300 Irish troops led by Alexander Cannon managed to arrive, along with a couple thousand Scottish reinforcements that were successfully mustered by John Murray, 1st Marquess of Atholl, at Blair Castle. Dundee's force now numbered anywhere between 2,440 to 3,000 men. In late July, Murray withdrew north and Mackay pursued him with roughly 3,600 to 5,100 men. Dundee marched with haste and intercepted Mackay's troops at the pass of Killiecrankie on July 27, 1689. The core of Mackay's army was composed of veteran regiments from the Dutch Scots Brigade, which included Bartle Balfour's, George Ramsay's, and Mackay's own regiment of foot, in addition to 2 newly raised pro-government Whig clan regiments from the Lowlands, the Earl of Leven's and Lord Kenmure's, which contributed around 1,400 men. The sole English regiment was under that of Ferdinando Hastings. There were also 2 small independent regiments of horse from the Lowlands, another from the Highlands, and some minuscule artillery pieces. Viscount Dundee's army was considerably smaller, and its core consisted of clan regiments such as the MacDonalds of Sleat, Glengarry, Clanranald, Macleans, Grants, and some Athelmen. There was also a detachment of around 300 professional Irish musketeers from Connaught under the command of Alexander Cannon, and the regiment of Sir Alexander Maclean composed of Irish, Scots regulars, and some Highlanders. Dundee also had a small lifeguard of 50 men composed of members of his old regiment, the Royal Regiment of Scots Horse, along with some volunteers. Mackay was intercepted on the narrow pass while marching north. In order to avoid being caught on his right flank, he deployed his army in a long line on a plateau nestled between the upper slopes and a steep back slope running down to the River Garry. Dundee's men stood on the upper eastern slopes and waited until dusk to attack. In order to prevent being outflanked, Mackay stretched his regiment's lines to form 3 ranks deep instead of the usual 6 ranks deep. Finally, when the time was right, with a deafening cheer, Dundee's men initiated the infamous Highlander charge straight from Mackay's lines. The first few volleys of musket fire were not enough to stop the ferocious charge, and Mackay attests that he gave the order for his musketeers to fix their plug bayonets. As the name implies, these particular bayonets were plugged right into the barrel of the musket, which prevented further firing or reloading. Because of this, fixing them was not ordered until the last possible moment. However, due to their inexperience against the speed of the Highlander charge, they were not able to fix them in time. When they were about 50 meters from the Williamite lines, the Highlanders fired a single musket volley, dropped their guns, and then scythed right into the ranks, butchering many with swords, axes, and spears. Bartel Balfour himself was slain, along with Hugh Mackay's younger brother James. The Williamite army began fleeing upon contact, with many on the right allegedly fleeing without firing a single shot. The Williamites suffered around 2,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. The Jacobites lost between 600 to 800 men. Despite winning the battle, the Jacobite losses proved crippling, as they had lost 1/3 of their army and their best commander, Dundee himself. Dundee, while advancing with his men and encouraging them during the charge, was shot off his horse. Dundee reputedly asked a soldier, "How goes the day?" To which the man replied, "Well for King James, but I am sorry for your lordship." The dying Dundee then replied, "If it goes well for him, it matters the less for me." Alexander Cannon took command of the Jacobites, but without adequate siege equipment to capture a port city, resupply became impossible. In addition, the lack of sufficient cavalry prevented the pursuit of Mackay's troops, and made them vulnerable to an open engagement with another potential government force. The Jacobites then decided to seize a small nearby town in Perth called Dunkeld in order to salvage some form of resupply. The Scottish Privy Council caught wind of this plan, and dispatched the Highland Cameronian Regiment to defend the town. The Cameronians had been raised just 3 months prior with no battle experience. They arrived at Dunkeld on August 19th. The next day, the regiment fortified the cathedral tower and the mansion of the Duke of Atholl. As the Jacobite Highlanders stormed through the town, they attempted to seize these defenses but were repulsed by the defenders, some of which used pikes and halberds to fend them off. The veteran commanding officer of the Cameronians, 27-year-old Colonel William Cleland, was shot twice in the first hour of battle, dragging himself out of sight so his men would not witness his death. As some of the Jacobites began barricading themselves in vacant houses, the Cameronians managed to set these houses on fire, incinerating all those trapped inside. Around 11 p.m., exhausted and depleted of ammunition, the Highlanders finally withdrew, leaving behind around 300 dead and wounded. Williamite losses were reported to be between 20 to 50. The Jacobite cause in Scotland was finished for that year. Alexander Cannon disbanded his army, while Mackay spent the winter reducing Jacobite strongholds and constructing a new base to police the Highland clans at a wooden fort near Loch Harbour built by Oliver Cromwell in 1654, which he subsequently named Fort William in honor of the new king. By February of 1690, Thomas Buchan replaced Cannon as leader of the Scottish Jacobites, but could only mobilize a force of 800 men. Ignoring counsel from his Scottish officers to not advance past Colonialism, Buchan marched as far as Cromdale, where he encamped on the last day of April. He was met by a larger government force under Sir Thomas Livingston, commander of the garrison of Inverness. As Livingston approached with his men, on the opposite bank of the River Spey, the Jacobite forces started to retreat. Livingston's cavalry swiftly crossed the river and intercepted the Jacobites, who made a brief stand at the foot of the hill of Cromdale. Fortunately for the outnumbered Jacobites, a thick fog came down on the side of the mountain and enveloped them, forcing Livingston to halt the pursuit. The Jacobites lost around 500 men killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, while Livingston's losses were reported as no more than 100 casualties. With the defeat at Cromdale, the Jacobite rebellion was once again finished, but not for good, and Scotland would reappear as a key nation for the Jacobite cause in the near future. Regardless, while all this was happening, King William III had to personally confront the bigger Jacobite threat in Ireland, which we will cover eventually, so stay tuned for future videos.